The moment this happened, it changed the whole direction of the Iran nuclear story. And almost no one is explaining why. Early this morning, reports confirmed that Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi landed in St. Petersburg for a high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. Within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made something very clear. Russia's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium is still on the table. Not a rumor, not guesswork, but a standing, active offer. And then came the line that should stop you in your tracks. It has not been acted on. 4 simple words, but they show a huge geopolitical standoff that most people are completely missing. Because here's what is really happening under the surface. For months, the United States has repeated one main demand in every negotiation, every back-channel talk, every diplomatic signal. Iran must get rid of its enriched uranium. Not reduce it, not pause it, remove it. We are talking about roughly 450 kilograms enriched to 60%. Material that can be pushed to weapons grade in a matter of weeks. That is enough for multiple nuclear weapons. This is not just another condition on a long list. This is the condition. Every ceasefire discussion, every round of indirect talks, every political message finally comes back to this one non-negotiable demand. And now, out of nowhere, Russia steps in with a solution that on paper solves everything. Moscow is basically saying, give us the uranium, we will take it out of Iran, we will store it on Russian soil, we will reprocess it under international supervision. Iran keeps its nuclear system. The dangerous material leaves the country. The global community, including watchdogs like the International Atomic Energy Agency, can monitor the whole process. No war, no strikes, no escalation, just a diplomatic way out that avoids a global crisis. But here is the twist, the part no one can ignore. This deal, the one that checks every major box, was rejected. And that brings up the real question driving this whole video. If a solution exists that prevents conflict, meets the main demand, and helps stabilize the region, why was it turned down? Let me say this as clearly as possible, because most media coverage is dancing around it instead of saying it directly. Donald Trump rejected Vladimir Putin's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium. This is not guesswork. This was confirmed by Axios, where a US official said plainly, it hasn't been accepted. Now, on the surface, Washington's position sounds reasonable. They keep repeating, we need to see the uranium secured. But that phrase hides the real conflict. The United States agrees with the goal, but rejects the method. They want the uranium out of Iran, just not in Russian hands. And that difference, small on paper but huge in real life, is the whole story unfolding right now. Because look at what happens next. While Washington hesitates, Abbas Araghchi gets on a plane and flies straight to St. Petersburg to sit down with Putin. That is not a normal diplomatic visit. That is a signal. Iran is basically responding. If America will not accept Russia as the solution, we will talk to Russia directly anyway. And to really understand why this moment matters, you have to go back not months, but years to the base of this whole issue. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal that Trump left in 2018, Russia was already playing this exact role. Iran shipped out roughly 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile. And where did it go? To Russia. It was handled by Rosatom, stored, processed, and watched under international oversight. And here is the key point. This system worked. There were no major violations, no diversion of material, no breakdown in oversight. The International Atomic Energy Agency verified compliance for 3 years. The arrangement worked exactly as planned until the US walked away and put sanctions back in place. So when Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says today that Russia is the only country with positive experience handling Iran's uranium, he is not promoting Russia. He is stating a documented fact. This is not a theoretical offer. It is a replay of a system that already worked. Russia has the infrastructure, the legal framework, the storage ability, and the working relationship with the IAEA to do this again almost immediately. Even officials connected to Rosatom have said the transfer is technically possible even under difficult conditions. And experts point out that the systems to safely move and monitor the material already exist. So technically, diplomatically, and historically, the solution is sitting right there. Russia is ready. Iran is engaging. The IAEA can supervise. Everything lines up. Which brings us to the real question, the uncomfortable one that most Western coverage avoids. Why reject it? The answer has less to do with uranium and more to do with power. Washington's concern, based on reporting, is that letting Russia take and process Iran's uranium would raise Moscow's position in the global nuclear energy market. Russia, through Rosatom, already controls a big share of global uranium enrichment and nuclear fuel supply. If it takes Iran's stockpile, processes it, and maybe puts it back into the global fuel market, that strengthens Russia's leverage across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has spent years trying to reduce dependence on Russian nuclear services, that is a strategic loss. And to be fair, that concern is not irrational. It is a clear geopolitical calculation. But here is the cost of that decision, and it is a serious one. By rejecting Russia as the custodian, the US is basically demanding that Iran give up its uranium through a channel that does not benefit Russia. The problem is, those other channels barely exist. In reality, Iran is very unlikely to hand over its uranium directly to the United States. It is just as unlikely to trust US allies like France or Japan with that material. And the idea of destroying the uranium inside Iran would require a level of cooperation and trust that simply is not there. So what you are left with is a paradox. The US wants the uranium gone. Russia offers a proven way to remove it. Iran is willing to talk about it. But because of who controls the solution, not what the solution achieves, the deal stalls. And that is exactly why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters much more than it looks on the surface. So where does that leave the United States right now? In a position that is much more limited than it looks on the surface. By rejecting Vladimir Putin's uranium proposal, Washington has basically boxed itself into a corner. The only mechanism on the table that has actually worked before, the only one with a proven record, has already been dismissed. And while American officials search for an alternative that does not currently exist, one critical fact remains unchanged. Iran's enriched uranium stays inside Iran. That means the pressure campaign continues. Instability in global energy markets goes on. Oil prices stay high, and the broader conflict drags on without a clear way out. Now look at Abbas Araghchi's move today in that context. His flight to St. Petersburg is not just diplomacy, it is strategy. Iran understands exactly the position the US has put itself in. Iran knows Washington rejected the Russian mechanism. It knows there is no ready replacement. And most importantly, it knows that without solving the uranium issue, the United States cannot end this crisis on its own terms. So instead of waiting, Iran is leaning into the one channel that still exists, Russia. And then Araghchi adds another layer to this when he speaks to Iranian state media. He describes the visit as a good chance for consultations with Moscow and stresses that these talks are especially important at this stage. That phrase is doing a lot of work. At this stage signals urgency, timing, and leverage. It tells you this is not normal coordination. It is a moment when the balance of influence is shifting. Talks are stalled. Washington is hesitating, and the uranium question remains unresolved. In that vacuum, Russia's role does not shrink, it grows. Why? Because, as Dmitry Peskov confirmed, the offer is still there. The mechanism exists. And by physically showing up in Russia, Iran is sending a message without saying it directly. The solution is available. It is ready to work, and it is waiting. But the United States chose not to use it. Before we continue the analysis, if you want clear sound and zero distractions, you must try these headphones. Check the link in the description and see the difference yourself. Okay. At the same time, Iran is making sure that if Washington eventually changes its position, or if pressure rises from global markets and allies that depend on stability in choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure for a deal is already in place and ready to move. Now add China to this equation, because what Beijing is not saying today is just as important as what Moscow is saying. Before Araghchi even got on his flight, he spoke with Wang Yi. That call happened before consultations with several regional players, which tells you something about priority and alignment. China had early visibility into Iran's thinking before others, and possibly before key developments became public. And yet today, China has stayed completely silent. No statements about the visit, no reaction to the uranium proposal, no public position at all. But that silence should not be mistaken for absence. China's relationship with Iran's strategic programs runs deep. There are several intelligence assessments pointing to Chinese components in Iran's missile systems, And Iran's military technology system has long relied on both Russian and Chinese support. Just days ago, China and Russia held talks with the International Atomic Energy Agency, specifically about Iran's nuclear program. That meeting happened on April 24th, just 3 days before Araghchi arrived in St. Petersburg. That sequence is not random. It suggests coordination, planning, and alignment before action. So what you are seeing is a layered process. The IAEA meeting acts as a coordination phase. Today's meeting in Russia looks more like an execution phase. And China is watching from a position of quiet strength. The country that has already secured long-term energy ties with Iran and has the economic leverage to shape outcomes without making noise. Which brings us back to the structural problem facing the United States. It is not just a diplomatic disagreement. It is a strategic dilemma. Washington needs Iran's uranium removed. Russia has the ability and the experience to remove it. The US rejected that path, and right now there is no workable other option that Iran would accept. That leaves only two real choices. Eventually rethink the Russian mechanism or pursue a much riskier path involving direct intervention. There have been discussions confirmed in reporting about the possibility of special operations forces securing nuclear material inside Iran. But think about what that actually means. That is not a diplomatic solution. That is a military escalation. It would likely violate any ceasefire framework, require extremely complex coordination, and almost certainly trigger a response from Iran that could widen the conflict in unpredictable ways. It is a scenario filled with variables that no one can fully control. So this is the reality at this moment. As Araghchi sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg, the only peaceful solution to remove Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and rejected by the United States. The only alternative involves force, with all the risks that come with it. And meanwhile, the situation on the ground keeps getting worse. Maritime tensions rise, economic pressure grows, and the diplomatic window that was supposed to open during a ceasefire is slowly closing. Now, here is where the situation becomes almost impossible to ignore. Donald Trump himself said that the uranium issue is 99% of the deal. That is not an interpretation, that is his own framing. J.D. Vance repeated the same idea. So if the uranium question represents nearly the whole agreement, and the only workable mechanism to solve it has already been rejected, then what you are really looking at is this. The United States has effectively blocked 99% of its own path to a deal. That is not a small diplomatic setback, that is the center of the whole process. And that is exactly why Araghchi is sitting in St. Petersburg with Vladimir Putin right now. This meeting is not about deciding whether Russia will take the uranium. That part has already been signaled. It is about the fine print, the timeline, the verification structure with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the technical safeguards, and most importantly, the guarantees that Russia cannot simply turn around and use that material to grow its power in the global nuclear fuel market. And here is the key insight. Those are solvable problems. These are not existential geopolitical barriers. They are engineering, legal, and regulatory questions. They can be negotiated, structured, and enforced. And Iran is in Russia right now precisely because the bigger strategic question is already settled. Russia is willing. Iran is open to it. The IAEA can oversee it. The only missing piece in this equation is a yes from Washington. Now, to be fair, there is a counter-argument, and it deserves to be addressed directly. The concern is that Russia is not acting out of goodwill. Vladimir Putin is not offering to take Iran's uranium as a favor to the international community. He is doing it because it gives Moscow leverage. It strengthens Russia's role in the global nuclear fuel supply chain. It positions Russia as a central player in any post-conflict Middle East framework. And from Washington's point of view, giving that kind of strategic advantage to Moscow is a serious concern. That skepticism is not irrational. It is grounded in real geopolitical competition. But here is the critical question. Not whether Russia benefits, but whether the alternative is better. Because the alternative is what we are seeing right now. A long blockade. A ceasefire that exists more on paper than in real life. Rising tensions in critical trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz. High oil prices that spread through global markets and hit consumers directly. And most importantly, Iran's enriched uranium still sitting inside Iran, unchanged, unresolved, and becoming more and more central to the crisis. When you compare those outcomes, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism starts to look heavier than the benefit of denying Moscow more influence. That is the calculation that was made and rejected. And that rejection is exactly why Arachi is in St. Petersburg today, while Washington is basically waiting for a different solution to appear. Now, looking ahead, the next phase of this story becomes even more important. What is likely happening behind closed doors right now is not abstract discussion, but refinement. Russia is expected to present a more detailed, updated version of its uranium custody proposal, more specific than earlier versions. This would likely include clear timelines for transfer, defined storage conditions, structured IAEA oversight, and most importantly, clear limits on what Russia can do with the material once it has it. That last part is the heart of the American objection. Concerns about resale, reprocessing, and market leverage. If this updated proposal includes binding guarantees, real limits that prevent Russia from turning Iran's uranium into a geopolitical asset without wider consent, then the main U.S. concern is at least partly addressed. From there, the process becomes diplomatic transmission. Arachi carries the framework back to Iran. It moves through regional intermediaries. It eventually lands back on Washington's desk. And at that point, the decision becomes unavoidable. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If it is accepted, the effects are immediate. The uranium issue, the 99%, is resolved. Pressure on global trade routes eases. The path to ending the conflict opens. But if it is rejected again, the consequences are just as clear. The conflict continues, and the diplomatic record begins to tell a very specific story. Iran signaled willingness. Russia provided a mechanism, and the United States said no twice. That story matters. It shapes alliances, influences global perception, and affects how future negotiations are framed. And then there is China. Quiet, but far from absent. Wang Yi and Beijing have taken a position of strategic silence. No public statements, no visible pressure, no open alignment in today's headlines. But behind that silence is influence. China continues to buy Iranian oil, giving Iran economic breathing room. It has already taken part in talks with Russia and the IAEA on Iran's nuclear issue. It acts as a stabilizing force for Iran, not by speaking loudly, but by making sure Iran has the ability to wait. In many ways, China is shaping the environment without stepping into the spotlight. It is present without looking present. And that quiet presence is what allows Iran to sit in St. Petersburg today, working with Russia instead of rushing to answer Washington. Which brings us back to the simplest, most revealing image of this whole situation. Donald Trump said there is a phone, a line of communication, a path forward. But that phone has not rung. Instead, Arachi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the one country that needs that mechanism the most has still not accepted it. Now, let me add one more layer because this may be the most important piece of the whole puzzle, and it goes far beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before this conflict grew worse, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This was not a symbolic